One star had a daughter and walked past her at Hollywood parties for 25 years without saying a single word. Another gave his second family the warmth he deliberately withheld from his first. These are 10 golden age secrets that will change the way you watch every film they ever made. Clark Gable, the king's secret daughter. In 1935, Clark Gable was not merely a movie star. He was the undisputed king of Hollywood, a title the industry had bestowed upon him formally and without irony. Tall, broad-shouldered, possessing a magnetism that seemed to operate independently of anything he said or did, Gable occupied a throne that no other actor of his era could credibly challenge. He had arrived there through a particular combination of qualities that the camera loved and that audiences trusted instinctively. A physical authority that never tipped into menace, a charm that never curdled into self-satisfaction, and an emotional directness that made every scene he was in feel slightly more real than the scenes surrounding it. It Happened One Night had won him the Academy Award in 1934, confirming his standing and imposing upon it a new set of expectations. He was now not merely a star, but a legitimized one, which meant the distance between what the public believed about him and what could be permitted to be known had become, if anything, more critical to maintain. In the spring of 1935, Gable traveled to the Canadian wilderness to film The Call of the Wild alongside Loretta Young. The production was a 20th Century Pictures project, which meant that for the duration of the shoot, both stars were operating somewhat outside the immediate protective radius of their studio's machinery. Location shoots in that era were extended, isolated affairs, weeks away from the press agents and publicity supervisors whose presence in Los Angeles served as a constant reminder of the image that had to be maintained. What happened between them during those weeks was, at the time, known only to a very small circle. Young became pregnant. For two people whose careers depended entirely on public perception, the situation was not merely inconvenient, it was professionally catastrophic. Neither could acknowledge what had happened. Neither did. Young quietly withdrew from public view, citing illness. She gave birth to a daughter in secret and placed the infant in an orphanage, her own child, surrendered anonymously as if she were a stranger. Months later, she returned to that same orphanage and formally adopted the little girl, naming her Judy. To the world, it was a story of a generous actress opening her home to an orphaned child. To those who looked closely enough, something else was visible entirely. Judy Lewis grew up in Hollywood, the same Hollywood where Clark Gable remained the king, where his photograph appeared in every magazine, where his face looked down from billboards with the easy authority of a man who had never had a secret worth keeping. She grew up watching her mother's expression shift almost imperceptibly whenever his name entered a conversation. She grew up being told, gently and firmly, that some questions did not have answers. What Judy noticed, and what every Hollywood insider quietly observed, was written plainly across her own face. The ears, the jaw, the particular architecture of her features was not Loretta Young's at all. Those who knew both stars saw it immediately and said nothing. The studio system had not merely suppressed this secret, it had made suppressing it the only rational option available to everyone involved. What no one ever fully reckoned with was the specific cruelty of Judy's position within Hollywood itself. She was not hidden away from the industry. She grew up inside it. She attended events where Gable was present. She moved in circles where every adult in the room carried knowledge that she alone was denied. She could see something pass across people's faces, a recognition, quickly suppressed, of something they were not going to say. She described it in her autobiography as growing up fluent in a language everyone around her spoke and that no one would teach her. Gable himself, by accounts of those who knew him well, was not an entirely unfeeling man. Friends recalled that he would fall into a particular silence when Judy's name came up, setting down whatever was in his hand, going very still, and then redirecting the conversation with a deliberateness that those present understood meant the subject was closed. It was not the silence of a man who felt nothing, but the silence of a man who had made a decision he could not unmake and had learned to live inside it. He married Carol Lombard in 1939, and that happiness was by all accounts genuine. Lombard's passing in a plane crash in January of 1942 devastated him in ways those who knew him said he never fully recovered from. He passed away in November of 1960, having never spoken his daughter's name to her. Whatever he had carried about Judy Lewis went with him entirely. Judy eventually confronted her mother directly in 1966, 3 decades after her birth. Young confirmed it. In 1994, Judy published her autobiography, Uncommon Knowledge, laying out the full story with a clarity and absence of bitterness that was itself remarkable. What followed the publication was something few people anticipated. Judy did not become a symbol of Hollywood scandal. She became, in the years after the book appeared, a woman who had arrived at a hard-won and genuine peace. Someone who gave interviews not with bitterness, but with a reflective generosity toward everyone involved, including the father who had never acknowledged her. She spoke publicly about forgiveness, not as an abstraction, but as something she had done the actual work of achieving over years and decades till it was real. She described growing up with a fundamental question at the center of her identity. Not a question about Hollywood glamour or studio secrets, but the simplest and most human question a child can carry. The king of Hollywood had a daughter. He simply never let her know he knew. Bing Crosby, the crooner's 2 families. If Clark Gable's secret cost his daughter a father, then the secret carried by America's most beloved crooner cost his first family something perhaps even harder to name. Bing Crosby did not hide a child born out of wedlock or suppress a wartime affair. His secret was more domestic, more deliberate, and in some ways more devastating for being so close to home. To understand what Bing Crosby meant to the American public of the 1940s, you need to understand the specific texture of the relationship between his voice and the culture it inhabited. This was not merely a celebrity. It was something closer to a communal possession. Going My Way had made him a priest the entire country wanted as their own. A film that won him the Academy Award in 1944 and confirmed what his radio audience had suspected for a decade, that here was a man whose decency was not performed but actual, whose warmth was not manufactured but genuine. White Christmas had made him the sound of the holidays themselves. The best-selling single in the history of recorded music because it touched something in the American experience of home and family that nothing else had quite reached. His first marriage to actress Dixie Lee in 1930 had been, in its early years, a genuine love story. Dixie had been a talented singer and actress who surrendered her career to become the foundation of the household that Bing's image required. They had 4 sons, Gary, Philip, Dennis, and Lindsay. And from the outside, the Crosby family appeared to be exactly what the public imagined, the natural private extension of the warmth that Bing projected on screen and over the airwaves. What Gary Crosby described in his 1983 memoir, Going My Own Way, was something that the outside had been very carefully prevented from seeing. The memoir was written with the particular precision of a man who had spent a lifetime trying to understand something and had finally arrived at a place where he could describe it without the description itself destroying him. What he described was a household organized around performance, the performance of the very qualities that Bing's public image embodied. The surface looked exactly as it was supposed to look. Beneath it was a different architecture entirely. Gary described a father who was physically present and emotionally absent in a way that was systematic rather than incidental. The weekly weigh-ins, lining his sons up, recording their weights, with consequences for those who had gained, were not the behavior of a distracted man. They were the behavior of a man who had organized his relationship with his children around control rather than connection. The physical discipline that Gary documented, confirmed by Philip and Dennis in their own subsequent accounts, was administered with a regularity and coldness that those outside the family would not have believed possible from the man they heard on the radio every Christmas. Gary described Christmas mornings in the Crosby household. The tree, the presents, the surface of a perfect American family tableau, and the silence underneath it. the sense of performing a family rather than being one. He wrote about one Thanksgiving specifically. The table set correctly, the food prepared correctly, his father seated at the head of it, radiating the composed authority that the occasion required, and the complete absence of anything that felt like warmth or ease or the simple pleasure of being together. Every holiday in that house, Gary wrote, felt like a production being mounted for an audience that wasn't there. He wrote about standing in the family kitchen as a teenager, having won a school award the previous day, watching his father walk past without acknowledgement. Not cruelty exactly, simply the complete absence of the attention a son waits his whole childhood to receive. Dixie Lee passed from cancer in 1952. Those who knew her in her final years described a woman of considerable dignity, navigating an isolation she had not anticipated, a talent in her own right, who had become, by the end, largely invisible. Her sons watched her pass and were left in the care of a man who processed the loss with the same efficient emotional management he had always applied to inconvenient things. Lindsay, the youngest of the four, a gentle and quietly artistic young man who had spent his adult years struggling to find solid ground beneath him, chose to end his life in 1989, a tragedy those who knew the family connected, at least in part, to wounds that had never properly healed, and to a childhood that had never given him the foundation a person needs to withstand the weight of a difficult life. In 1957, Bing married Katharine Grant, an actress 30 years his junior. They had 3 children together, Harry, Mary, and Nathaniel. And those 3 children, when they spoke about their father after his passing in 1977, described someone that Gary Crosby and his brothers would not have recognized. A warm father, an engaged father, a man who attended school events and expressed affection openly and made his children feel they were the most important thing in his world. The same man, the same California, a completely different family experience. For Gary and his brothers, this was not a revelation that brought understanding or peace. It was the hardest possible confirmation of what they had always feared might be true, that the warmth they were denied had always existed within their father. He had simply chosen not to offer it to them. There is no comfortable place to set that knowledge down. Gary passed away in 1995, carrying it with him, unresolved and unresolvable, a question that had received the worst possible answer. If these stories are moving you the way they move us, please take a moment to subscribe to Golden Age Files. We have 7 more extraordinary revelations still to come, and they only grow more remarkable from here. Rock Hudson, the family that was never allowed to exist. Rock Hudson stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, possessed a jaw that seemed architecturally designed for the cinema, and projected a masculine ease so complete and so natural that it became, for an entire generation of American women, the standard by which all other men were quietly measured. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, he was Hollywood's definitive leading man, not merely attractive, but safe. Not merely charming, but trustworthy. The romantic fantasies he embodied on screen felt achievable precisely because he seemed so thoroughly, reliably, and uncomplicatedly a man. The machinery that produced and maintained this image was operated primarily by Henry Wilson, Hudson's agent. Wilson had discovered Hudson, born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. in Winnetka, Illinois, and had not merely represented him, but constructed him from the ground up. The name was Wilson's invention. The image was Wilson's blueprint. When rumors began circulating in 1955, rumors of the kind that, if confirmed, would have ended Hudson's career instantly and permanently, Wilson's solution was characteristically direct. He arranged a marriage. Phyllis Gates, a secretary in Wilson's own office, became Hudson's wife in November of 1955, in a ceremony that served its strategic purpose entirely. The marriage ended in divorce in 1958, having done what it was designed to do. Behind the constructed image, behind the sham marriage, behind the carefully managed public appearances, Rock Hudson had a real family. His name was Robert Benavides. The 2 men met in the late 1950s. And what developed between them was not a secret affair conducted in stolen moments, but a domestic partnership of extraordinary depth and duration. They grew grapes together on a California vineyard. They had dinner together every evening. Hudson was not on a set. They argued about ordinary things and resolved them the way any couple does who have built a life together and mean to protect it. They traveled together when Hudson's schedule permitted, to destinations where they were unknown and could simply be two people without the elaborate performance that Hollywood required of them at home. For 35 years, Benavides was the person Rock Hudson came home to. What those 35 years actually looked like in practice was the accumulation of an entire life shared in deliberate, careful privacy. They developed the routines that couples develop, the particular rhythms of a household that has been jointly inhabited long enough that each person knows without asking what the other needs. The vineyard was not merely a hobby. It was something they had built from the ground up and tended through the seasons with the specific satisfaction of people who have chosen to make something together that requires patience and commitment and will outlast any single year's effort. Those who visited them there, the small circle permitted to see what Hudson's public life was required to conceal, described the atmosphere of that property as something that stopped them, the quality of ease between two people who had been choosing each other quietly and without acknowledgement for decades. Benavides managed the practical dimensions of Hudson's existence with a completeness that those who observed it found remarkable, not merely as an employee or a companion, but as a partner in the fullest sense, someone whose knowledge of Hudson extended to every corner of his life and whose devotion had been proven across every circumstance that 35 years can produce. None of this existed in any public account of Rock Hudson's life. Robert Benavides could not be named in a magazine, acknowledged at a premiere, or introduced to a journalist. The family that Hudson had actually built, sustained by 35 years of real love and real commitment, was required to be invisible. What the public received instead was the image of a bachelor who somehow never quite found the right woman. In the summer of 1985, Hudson traveled to Paris and collapsed. His AIDS diagnosis, confirmed publicly in July of that year, made him the first major celebrity in America to put a recognizable human face on a condition that much of the country had preferred to regard as someone else's problem. The courage of that disclosure transformed something. Donations to AIDS research organizations doubled in the months following his announcement. In his will, Hudson left $250,000 to help establish what became the American Foundation for AIDS Research. The man who had spent his entire career performing a false identity used his final months to protect others who were living the same impossible secret. Robert Benavides was with him when he passed away in October of 1985. He had been there, faithfully and invisibly, for 35 years. In the years that followed, Benavides devoted himself to preserving Hudson's legacy with the same quiet dedication he had brought to everything else, maintaining the property they had shared, giving careful and measured interviews when he chose to speak at all, and ensuring that the record of what they had built together was not erased a second time. History should know his name: Gary Cooper and Patricia Neal, the child she could never speak of Rock. Hudson's real family was hidden by an industry that refused to acknowledge it existed. Our next story reveals something the studios worked even harder to erase. Not a family that was hidden, but a child who was never permitted to be born at all. Patricia Neal described it in her 1988 autobiography as the saddest thing that ever happened to her. She had spent 40 years finding the words. What she eventually wrote was not a confession or an accusation, but something quieter and more costly. A reckoning with a loss she had been required to carry without any of the ordinary consolations that grief permits. When Patricia Neal was cast opposite Gary Cooper in The Fountainhead, she was 23 years old. He was 48, twice decorated by the Academy, and possessed of a moral authority so naturally worn that it seemed less like a performance than a fact of his character. What developed between them was, by Neal's own account, a genuine love. not a studio romance manufactured for publicity purposes, but the kind of feeling that reorganizes a person's understanding of what they are capable of. The affair continued for several years, carefully managed by studio intervention and the discretion of a press corps that, in that era, still observed certain boundaries. In 1950, Neal became pregnant. An illegitimate pregnancy in Hollywood in 1950 would have ended her career before it had fully begun. The revelation of Cooper's involvement would have shattered the image of integrity that was the foundation of his entire professional identity. Cooper, a Catholic, arranged the procedure, not permitted under California law at that time, and not without genuine physical risk. Neal underwent it. The relationship did not survive what followed. Cooper's wife Rocky discovered the affair and confronted Neal directly. Neal left Hollywood for Broadway. Cooper recommitted to his marriage and was, by accounts of those who knew him, haunted by what he had asked of the woman he had genuinely loved. He passed away from cancer in May of 1961, having never spoken publicly about their relationship. His guilt had become part of him in a way that nothing subsequent had been able to dissolve. Neal wrote in her autobiography that the complications from the procedure may have contributed to her difficulty carrying later pregnancies to term, a physical consequence compounding a grief that was already, by any measure, considerable. In 1965, she suffered a series of strokes that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. The recovery she mounted over the years that followed, painstaking, deliberate, driven by a will that those who witnessed it described as something beyond ordinary determination, returned her to the screen and eventually earned her a second Academy Award nomination. She found happiness in her marriage to writer Roald Dahl and built a life that was, by her own account, genuinely full. Patricia Neal was not a woman defined by what she had lost. She was a woman who had carried an enormous private grief, survived an almost unsurvivable physical catastrophe, and come back from both with her voice and her talent and her dignity entirely intact. She never called the loss a sorrow for what might have been. She called it a grief for what was, however briefly, however impossibly, real. Charlie Chaplin, the Tramp's shadow children. Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr. was 6 years old when he began to understand that his father's tenderness was reserved for the camera. Sidney had 5. They were the sons of the most famous man in the world, and they grew up largely without him. What their father created on screen, the shuffling walk, the battered hat, the cane, the expression of dignified poverty that made audiences across every language and culture recognize something essential about the human condition, was among the most indelible images in cinema history. City Lights, Modern Times, The Great Dictator. These are not merely successful films. They are arguments, made in the language of pure cinema, for the dignity of the powerless and the moral weight of the overlooked. To hold them alongside the documented record of Chaplin's private conduct is genuinely uncomfortable. It is also necessary. Chaplin was not simply a performer. He was, by his own deeply held understanding, an artist of the highest order, a man whose Little Tramp was a philosophical statement, as much as an entertainment, a sustained argument for the value of the overlooked and the dispossessed. This self-understanding was not entirely without justification. The films were, and remain, extraordinary, but the gap between the compassion Chaplin expressed for the abstract figure of the powerless man on screen and the compassion he extended to the specific human beings in his private life was one of the most striking contradictions in Hollywood history. Chaplin's first marriage, in 1918, was to Mildred Harris. She was 16 years old. He was 29. Their son, born in 1919, passed away 3 days after his birth. The marriage ended in a divorce settlement that cost Chaplin considerably and that he resented for years afterward. 4 years later, Chaplin encountered Lita Gray on the set of The Gold Rush. She was 16. He was 35. She became pregnant. Under California law at the time, what Chaplin faced was not merely personal embarrassment, but potential legal exposure. A private ceremony was arranged in Mexico in November of 1924, across the state line from the jurisdiction whose laws he was navigating around. Lita Gray gave birth to 2 sons in rapid succession, Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr. in 1925 and Sidney Earl Chaplin in 1926. The divorce filing she submitted in January of 1927 ran to 52 pages. Its reported allegations were sufficiently serious that newspapers across the country covered the story with a thoroughness that cost Chaplin considerable public sympathy. The specific details were suppressed in the contemporary press to a degree that itself speaks to the power Chaplin commanded. Charles Jr. and Sidney grew up knowing that their father was the most famous man in the world, and that this fame did not translate into presents. Charles Jr. later wrote his own memoir, published in 1960, describing his father with a complexity that neither condemned nor excused. He wrote about visiting his father on set as a boy and watching the little tramp come to life before the camera, and feeling, standing just off camera, both proud and profoundly alone. The pride was real. The aloneness was equally real. The man who could make the tramp live with a tilt of his hat could not, or would not, make his son feel that his presence in the room had been noticed and was welcome. After those visits, Charles Jr. would sometimes go to the local cinema and watch his father's films with a room full of strangers, sitting in the dark while the audience around him laughed and wept at the little tramp, trying to find in the flickering image the man who had been standing 10 feet away and had looked straight through him. Those 2 boys eventually found their way back to their father. Chaplin's final marriage to Una O'Neill in 1943 produced 8 children and was by every credible account a genuinely loving and lasting partnership. The tenderness he had withheld from Charles Jr. and Sidney, he gave freely to the children of his later years. The tramp who championed the powerless and the man whose private conduct told a different story, both are part of what he left behind. The audience is left, as perhaps it should be, to hold both without being told which matters more. Rita Hayworth, the woman they replaced. Rita Hayworth's photograph appeared on the lockers of American servicemen stationed across the Pacific during the Second World War. It had been published in Life magazine in August of 1941, and it traveled everywhere that American men went in the years that followed. A single image that became, for an entire generation of soldiers, the distilled symbol of what they understood themselves to be fighting for. But the woman in that photograph was not who they believed her to be. Her name was not Rita Hayworth. It was Margarita Carmen Cancino, and the distance between those 2 names represented one of the most deliberate acts of erasure the studio system ever performed on a living human being. Margarita had been born in Brooklyn in 1918 to Eduardo Cancino, a Spanish dancer of considerable talent, and his wife, Volga Haworth. The Cancino family was a dancing family. Eduardo performed in a duo with his daughter from the time she was 12 years old, touring the casino circuit along the California-Mexico border. Margarita was talented. She was also to the executives at Columbia Pictures, who first observed her in the early 1930s, insufficiently American for the mainstream audience they intended to reach. The transformation was systematic and complete. Her naturally dark hairline was altered through electrolysis, painful, time-consuming, and permanent, to produce the higher forehead the studio considered more marketable. Her hair was dyed auburn. Her name was formally changed. Her background was rewritten in every studio biography, and the Cancino family were required to recede into a carefully maintained invisibility, present in her private life and non-existent in her public one. What Columbia presented in their place was a fabrication, an all-American girl whose origins required no further examination. The 1989 biography by Barbara Leeming, still considered the most thoroughly researched account of Hayworth's life, documented the full dimensions of this erasure, drawing in part on the accounts of Orson Welles, who was married to Hayworth from 1943 to 1947. Leeming documented the private reality the public image was constructed to conceal. The childhood touring with Eduardo had contained within it a darkness that Hayworth eventually disclosed to Welles. a shadow that informed the particular quality of painful knowledge her best performances carried beneath their surface glamour. She once said, in a remark that became one of Hollywood's most quoted observations, that men went to bed with Gilda and woke up with her. The wit of it obscured the wound every time, and that was precisely the problem. Every man who heard it laughed at the cleverness and missed entirely what she was telling them. She was not making a joke about fame or illusion. She was describing a loneliness so complete that she had learned to deliver it as a punchline, because no other form had ever made anyone actually stop and hear it. Gilda was the invention. The woman who woke up every morning was Margarita Cancino, a person who had been systematically replaced, at the industry's insistence, by a more commercially viable fiction. In her final years, as Alzheimer's descended and claimed her memory in layers, those who cared for Hayworth reported something that stopped them cold. She sometimes reverted to Spanish in her speech, Margarita surfacing as Rita receded, the original woman outlasting the invented one. The studio had covered her over, but could not reach what the illness eventually uncovered. Margarita Cancino survived Rita Hayworth. That, in the end, may be the truest thing we can say about her. Rex Harrison, the most charming man in the room. Carol Landis was 29 years old in the summer of 1948. She was talented, she was beautiful, and she was completely in love with a man who was married to someone else. On the evening of July 4th, that man came to her home in Pacific Palisades for dinner. He ate, he left. The next morning, she was found having chosen to end her life. Her name was Carol Landis. His name was Rex Harrison. Harrison's charm was not the ordinary kind. It was not warmth exactly, nor was it the democratic ease that made other performers accessible to every audience, regardless of background. Harrison's charm was specifically aristocratic, the charm of a man so thoroughly at ease within his own considerable gifts that the normal expectations of accountability seemed, in his presence, to apply somewhat less rigorously than they did to other people. On screen, it produced Professor Henry Higgins, one of the most indelible characterizations in the history of musical theater and film. In private life, it produced a record that those who loved him found considerably more difficult to celebrate. He was married 6 times. The timelines of these marriages, examined with any care, reveal a man for whom the transition between one relationship and the next involved a brevity of interval that suggested romantic commitment and romantic conclusion were occurring in closer proximity than the official accounts tended to acknowledge. He fathered children across these relationships, children who grew up navigating a father whose attention and presence followed the arc of his romantic interest and tended to diminish as that interest moved elsewhere. Harrison was, at the time of Landis's passing, married to his second wife, Lily Palmer. The nature of his relationship with Landis was known within the Hollywood community, if not to the general public. The coroner's investigation and the press coverage that followed documented Harrison's departure from the scene before the authorities arrived, a fact reported at the time and remaining part of the historical record. Harrison was never charged with any wrongdoing in connection with Landis's passing. That is a fact that must be stated clearly and honored completely. What the record also shows is that the official response to the tragedy moved with considerable efficiency toward a narrative that centered Harrison's distress and his career considerations rather than the woman whose life had ended. Noel Harrison, Rex's son from his marriage to Lily Palmer, gave accounts in later years that were quietly devastating in what they revealed about the experience of being the child of a man whose extraordinary gifts came with an equally extraordinary capacity for self-exemption. The biography, Fatal Charm, published in 1992, drew on extensive research to produce the most comprehensive account of Harrison's life and the private costs of the public legend. The charm was real. So was everything the charm made easier not to see. And Carol Landis, who had appeared in over 40 films, who had entertained troops across 4 theaters of war at genuine personal risk, who had been described by directors who worked with her as one of the most instinctively gifted comic actresses of her generation, deserved more from the record than a footnote in someone else's story. History should give her that, at minimum. We are approaching our final 2 stories. And before we continue, we would love to hear from you. Which of these revelations has stayed with you most? And which Golden Age star would you like us to explore in a future film? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Jean Tierney, the daughter the world never knew. If you had seen Jean Tierney on the set of Laura in 1944, the perfection of her face, the absolute composure of her bearing, you would have had no idea that she was already living inside a grief so complete it had no bottom. She smiled from the cover of every major magazine in America during the 1940s. It was, by any objective measure, one of the most extraordinary faces the cinema had ever found. A perfection of features so complete that it seemed almost architectural, as if it had been designed rather than born. She was Laura. She was Ellen Barrett in Leave Her to Heaven. She was the woman for whom audiences invented the word luminous and used it without embarrassment because no other word came close. Behind that smile, she carried a grief so private and so total that she would not find public words for it until 36 years after it began. Jean Tierney had arrived in Hollywood in 1940 with a combination of assets that the industry recognized immediately. She was beautiful in a way that the camera found endlessly interesting, a quality rarer than it sounds, because many faces that are beautiful in ordinary life become flat on film. Hers did the opposite. Directors and cinematographers of the era described her luminosity with a consistent bafflement that was itself a kind of tribute. She could also act, genuinely act, with a technical precision and emotional availability that her best roles rewarded fully. Laura required her to embody a presence that exists largely off-screen for the first half of the film, and then to justify, with her actual physical arrival, the obsession the story had been building. She justified it completely. The Academy nominated her for Leave Her to Heaven the following year. By 1945, she was one of the half-dozen most recognizable faces in American cinema. In the spring of 1943, at the height of this ascent, Tierney was pregnant with her first child. She attended a function at the Hollywood Canteen, where film stars entertained servicemen and women during the war years. At that event, a young female Marine, barely 20 years old, flushed with the excitement of being in the same room as someone she had watched on screen a dozen times, broke the quarantine her recent recovery from rubella required and approached Tierney, wanting nothing more than to meet the actress she admired. The encounter lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Its consequences lasted a lifetime. Tierney contracted rubella during her pregnancy. Her daughter Daria was born in October of 1943 with a constellation of severe disabilities, profoundly unable to hear, partially sighted, with significant developmental delays that made independent life impossible. Tierney and her husband, the designer Oleg Cassini, made the private decision to place Daria in institutional care, a decision made in the context of an era that offered limited alternatives and considerable social pressure toward exactly this resolution, but a decision that Tierney never ceased examining and regretting for the rest of her life. The public world was not told that Daria existed. The luminous smile continued to appear on magazine covers. The grief behind it had nowhere to go. What makes this almost unbearable to consider is what Tierney was doing publicly during the years she was carrying this privately. She was completing Leave Her to Heaven, receiving an Academy Award nomination for it, attending premieres in gowns, giving interviews about her craft, maintaining every outward requirement of stardom with a discipline that those around her found impressive, without ever understanding what it was costing her. Every photograph taken of her during those years captures a woman performing composure so perfectly that the performance itself became invisible. That is what grief looks like when it has nowhere to go. It looks exactly like everything is fine. There is a particular detail from her autobiography that has stayed with readers ever since she wrote it. She described visiting Daria at the institution, private visits unknown to the press, and sitting with her for hours. Daria could not communicate in the ways that most children communicate with their mothers. The visits were quiet in the way that only certain kinds of love are quiet. Not the quietness of absence, but the quietness of a presence so complete it has no need of words. Tierney wrote that she always left feeling simultaneously more broken and more certain. More broken because of what Daria could not have. More certain because Daria was real, and her love for her was real. And no amount of studio machinery could touch either of those facts. Oleg Cassini and Tierney divorced in 1952. The marriage had not survived what it had been asked to carry. What is almost impossible to absorb is that during the years her marriage was collapsing and her mental health was deteriorating, Tierney was simultaneously being required to show up as one of Hollywood's most luminous presences. She appeared in film after film, The Left Hand of God, The Egyptian, personal appearances and studio obligations fulfilled with a professionalism that concealed entirely what was happening beneath the surface. The woman on the magazine covers and the woman sitting alone in the hospital rooms were the same woman. Nobody in the audience watching her on screen had any idea. Tierney entered a period her autobiography described with unflinching honesty as the most challenging of her life: deteriorating mental health, hospitalizations, a relationship with her own stability that had become dangerously unreliable. She underwent 27 electroshock treatments, a figure she documented herself in her own words. Each treatment carried the risk of memory loss. She submitted to them 27 times. That she emerged from this period capable of the professional work she subsequently produced, and the emotional clarity she eventually demonstrated in her writing, speaks to a resilience that the word remarkable does not adequately honor. Years after Daria's birth, Tierney was at a social gathering when a woman approached her and, in the course of conversation, mentioned having broken quarantine during the war to meet her at the Hollywood canteen. The woman recounted it as a fond memory, a small wartime adventure. She had no idea. Tierney, according to her own account, said nothing. She excused herself, found her way out of the party, and sat alone in her car for a long time before she was able to drive home, absorbing in complete silence the fact that the woman who had altered the entire course of her life had done so out of nothing more than innocent admiration, and would go home that evening remembering a happy story. That restraint was its own kind of grace, a grace earned slowly and at extraordinary cost through decades of carrying something that most people would not have been able to carry at all. Her autobiography, published in 1979, told the complete story for the first time. She wrote it not to assign blame and not to seek sympathy, but because Daria deserved to be known. The daughter the world had never been permitted to see had a mother who had never stopped grieving her, never stopped loving her, and never, in all the years of silence, stopped knowing exactly what had been lost. Spencer Tracy. The Three Lives of Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy lived 3 lives simultaneously for 26 years. The most extraordinary thing about this is not that he managed it. It is that the 2 women who loved him both knew, and both chose to stay. Tracy had married Louise Treadwell in 1923. Their son, John, born in 1924, was found to be unable to hear. Tracy, a Catholic of the most serious and personally demanding kind, became convinced in the deeply private theology he carried that John's condition was divine punishment for his own sins, a conviction that imposed upon him a guilt so comprehensive and so unrelenting that it became the organizing fact of his interior life. He drank. He suffered. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him, an easy man to love in those years. Louise Treadwell loved him anyway, with a steadiness that would eventually find its expression in something far more lasting than any marriage ceremony. What Louise did in those early years was to become an expert in the thing that had broken her husband. She read everything available about hearing loss in children. She traveled to consult specialists. She corresponded with researchers and educators at a time when resources for parents of children who could not hear were almost non-existent. The dominant institutional advice was frequently to lower expectations and accept limitations. Louise Tracy refused to accept limitation as the defining condition of her son's life. She found educators who believed that children who could not hear could be taught to speak. She implemented their methods, and John Tracy, who had been told by some experts that spoken language was an unreasonable expectation, learned to speak, not perfectly, not easily, but genuinely, in a way that changed what his life could contain. He went on to graduate from the University of Southern California, to marry, and to live with a fullness and independence that those early experts had declared impossible. Louise had simply refused to believe them. In 1941, Tracy began working with Katharine Hepburn on Woman of the Year. What developed between them was not a brief professional attraction, but one of the most enduring partnerships in Hollywood history. 26 years of genuine love, maintained in full knowledge of its impossibility. Tracy would not dissolve his marriage. His Catholicism did not permit it. His guilt about John made the thought of abandoning Louise feel like one wrong compounding another. There was also, those who knew him believed, a genuine respect for Louise that coexisted with his love for Hepburn, a recognition that what Louise had done for John deserved protection rather than abandonment. He could not give her the marriage she deserved. He would not take from her the name and stability that her work required. Hepburn understood all of this and accepted it with a completeness that those who observed the arrangement found extraordinary. She was not a woman given to acceptance of things she could not change. Every account of her character emphasizes its formidable independence, its refusal of conventional expectation. But she accepted this. She asked for nothing that Tracy could not give. She received, in return, everything that he could. Louise knew she was not a woman living in ignorance of her husband's life. She was a woman who had made a calculation, fully informed, and arrived at a position she could maintain with dignity. The three of them navigated something that had no established template, in an era that provided no language for it, and they navigated it with less visible wreckage than many arrangements far less complicated. In 1942, Louise founded the John Tracy Clinic in Los Angeles, an organization dedicated to teaching children who could not hear to speak and to helping their families understand how to reach them. It offered its services free of charge because Louise understood that the families who needed it most were frequently those who could least afford to pay. The clinic became internationally renowned. Families came from across the world. A mother from rural Japan who had been told her daughter would never communicate and who flew to Los Angeles with money she had saved for 3 years. A father from a small town in England who had been informed by 3 separate specialists that his son's case was hopeless. Parents from Brazil and Australia and Nigeria who had heard about a clinic in California where someone had decided that no child's case was hopeless. They sat in those rooms and learned otherwise. They went home with tools and knowledge, and something that most of them described afterward with the same word, hope, that they had stopped permitting themselves to feel before they arrived. The private guilt that had helped to strain Tracy's first marriage became, through Louise's extraordinary act of redirection, a legacy that outlasted everyone involved. Hepburn made anonymous donations to the clinic, documented by James Curtis in his definitive 2011 biography. The woman who could not be publicly acknowledged gave money, without her name attached, to the institution founded by the wife of the man she loved. When Louise learned of those donations years later, she said she had always known, and that it had never surprised her. 2 women who never shared a room, who never spoke directly about the man they both loved, had understood each other completely across the distance that his choices had placed between them. There is something in that, in its quietness, its generosity, its complete absence of bitterness on either side, that is almost too human to absorb directly. Tracy passed away in June of 1967, 17 days after completing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the last film he made with Hepburn, about the right of 2 people to love each other across the boundaries society imposes. Hepburn was present at the house when he passed. Louise was informed and conducted herself in her grief with the same dignity she had brought to every other aspect of an arrangement that would have broken many people entirely. She outlived Tracy by 16 years. passing in 1983, having spent the intervening decades continuing the work of the clinic she had built from what had wounded her. 3 people, one impossible configuration, and a redemption written not in any of their names, but in the voices of thousands of children who, because of what Louise built from what had wounded her, were able to hear their mothers call them home. Loretta Young, the saint with the impossible secret. Loretta Young's image in 1930s. Hollywood was not merely that of a talented actress. It was something closer to a moral institution. She was known throughout the industry for the swear jar she kept on her film sets, a pointed reminder that certain standards would be maintained on her productions, regardless of what habits prevailed elsewhere. She attended Mass with a regularity that her colleagues found both admirable and slightly exhausting. Studios cast her in roles specifically because her presence elevated a picture's respectability. Her reputation as Hollywood's Catholic conscience was not a publicity construction. It was, by every account, a genuine reflection of how Loretta Young understood herself, which makes what she carried for 60 years all the more extraordinary to contemplate. Young had built her identity around a specific and coherent moral architecture. This was not the casual religiosity that many in Hollywood wore as a kind of social accessory. It was a daily, practiced, demanding faith that governed her decisions on set and off. The kind of faith that does not permit convenient exceptions, does not offer easy absolution. She was not performing piety. She was living it, as fully and as publicly as any star of her era. Which means that what happened in Canada in 1935 did not merely create a practical problem. It created a crisis at the very center of who she understood herself to be. The woman who placed the swear jar on her film sets was the same woman who placed her own child in an orphanage. She carried both of those facts for the rest of her life, and neither of them was ever simple. The affair with Gable on the Call of the Wild location shoot was not something Young ever fully explained or excused. What she communicated, in fragments across decades, was the collision it represented between the woman she was publicly and the woman who had found herself in the Canadian wilderness in an impossible situation. The pregnancy that followed was not something her faith permitted her to address in the way the studio system might otherwise have managed, and it was not something her career could survive if it became known. Her own child was placed in an orphanage. Her own child was later adopted by her as a stranger. Judy Lewis grew up in that extraordinary fiction. Loved, certainly, but loved as something other than what she actually was, by a mother whose guilt manifested as an inability to give her daughter the one thing she most needed to know. Those who observed the Young household noted something careful and slightly anxious in Loretta's manner whenever Judy was in proximity to anyone who might look too closely at the resemblance that was, by the time Judy entered her teens, essentially impossible to ignore. What Loretta Young was required to do, year after year, was to look at her own daughter and perform a version of their relationship that was not true. Every birthday, every school event, every ordinary moment of domestic life. The love was real. Those who knew the household never doubted that. But the love was encased in a lie so fundamental that it shaped everything the love could be and do. Judy could feel the encasement without knowing its dimensions. She described it, in later years, as growing up with a persistent sense that something important was being withheld, not unkindly, but completely. A mother who loved her and would not fully reach her. The gap it gave you, the portraits and the premieres and the carefully managed smiles, and it trusted that you would never look behind them. You looked. These were real people, imperfect, complicated, carrying things that the golden age was never designed to hold. The fact that they carried them anyway, and still made the art they made, and still loved the people they loved as fully as the world permitted them to, that is not a diminishment of who they were. It is the fullest possible picture of it. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, where the real stories behind the golden dreams are finally told. If this film moved you, please share it with someone who loves classic Hollywood. Every like, every share, and every new subscriber helps us keep telling these stories the way they deserve to be told, with the full truth and the full humanity of the people who made this era what it was. We have many more extraordinary lives still to explore, and we would love to have you with us for every one of them. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for looking behind the curtain, because these stars, in all their imperfect and beautiful complexity, deserve to be truly known.